morning, everyone, and welcome to our amaBhungane masterclass. As you may know, amaBhungane means dung beetles. So, like our namesake, we're dedicated to digging dung or exposing corruption and malfeasance. So, today we've got some of our team of investigative journalists who are going to be sharing some of the tips and tricks of the trade. So, to start off, we've got Susan Comrie. Susan is an experienced investigative journalist who's worked at Carte Blanche and City Press before joining amaBhungane, and she's been rewarded with many awards for her stellar investigative work. So over to you, Susan.
Thanks, Charisse. So I get the easy job today. I'm just going to introduce you guys to a tiny bit of the work that we do and just kind of give you a taste of amaB and the work that we undertake. So I think there's a common misconception that that at amaB we only focus on the state, and that's technically not true. I mean, what we focus on is really the intersection between the state and the private sector, and it's really about where public money moves into private hands and the kind of abuse that happens there. So one of the things that I am always amazed by is how quickly, when one is looking at money that's in the public money that moves into the hands of large corporations, you know, some of these multinationals, these respected brands all over the world, how quickly or how short the connection is between those companies with stellar reputations and really dirty money, really dirty practices. And I'm sure all of you are kind of wondering, okay, how do I go about finding that connection? How do I go about, you know, digging below the surface and finding the dirty money that's linked to these massive companies? And one of the most effective ways to do that is really to start with a basic question, which is what I'm going to quickly run through with you today. Anyway, so the basic question, one of the most basic questions that we ask of companies is, what is it that you actually do? And one of the examples that I want to give you is McKinsey. So if you were a journalist in 2013, and you had gone into any editor's office to say, look, I want to do a story about how McKinsey is linked to a massive state capture project that's taking millions, you know, millions are being channeled into letterbox companies and into a sort of global money laundering network. Most editors would have, you know, at least raised a skeptical eyebrow, if not sort of kick you out of their office, because this was the kind of reputation that McKinsey had at the time. You know, this incredibly influential company and really one of the most successful consulting firms. What we know, though, is that in South Africa, McKinsey had received a consulting contract from Transnet, our state rail operator. Now, in order to get that contract, they had to partner with a local consulting firm. And they chose to partner with a company called Regiments Capital. Now, whether they were forced into that partnership, whether it was an optional choice, we don't know. But essentially, they agreed that they would split the fees that they received on that contract 50-50. Now, what we've since discovered is that at the time, Regiments had signed an agreement with a company called Gateway, which was sitting in the United Arab Emirates, inside a tax and secrecy haven. And they had agreed that they would pay Gateway between, the amounts varied from contract to contract, but they would pay them between 30 and 60% of the value that Regiments got. So let me just quickly explain that. So Regiments is getting 50% of the contract. They agreed to pass on between, let's say on average, they agree to pass on half of the fees that they receive from the contract onto this company, Gateway. So Gateway ends up getting, say, on average, 25% of the total contract value. And the question is, what do they actually do in order to deserve that fee that they get? Now, the contract that we've seen, it describes business development services, and essentially Gateway is saying, we will help you to get business from the state in South Africa. Now, I'm going to get to this bit in a little bit where you see the little arm coming off. But let me quickly just tell you how this all worked out. So the contract was signed. Regiments and McKinsey get this huge consulting contract at Transnet, and they agree that they're going to pass on money to Gateway in the UAE. Now, the thing is, Gateway is sitting inside a tax and secrecy haven, so it's almost impossible to find out any information about them, about who owns the company, who the directors are, what they do, anything. But the problem is that in order to get the money there, they would have had to pass through the Reserve Bank. And the Reserve Bank in South Africa is going to start asking some very difficult questions about who these, what is this company doing in order to take roughly a quarter of a government contract. What are they doing to deserve those millions and hundreds of millions of rands that they're getting? So what we suspect happened is that instead, Gateway ceded the contract to a whole bunch of local, what we call letterbox companies. So companies that basically exist as a postal address. They have a sort of front director, and they really don't do anything terribly valuable. And what we found is that this contract and these payments bounce between a series of these letterbox companies. And when we went looking for these companies, we would end up in places like this, really, rundown blocks of flats. Sometimes we'd end up just finding a locked door at the top of the building. And these are companies that are taking, and then in some instances, literally a post box. And that's the only trace of the company. And in some cases, these companies were taking, tens of millions of rands at a time off these state contracts. Now, you'll remember this little bit that I said I was going to come back to. You'll see the small arm coming off here. A small percentage of that contract goes to another business development partner called Albertine. Now, I just want to warn everyone, there's an audio clip that I want to play. There's a lot of swearing in it. So if you're in an open plan office, you might want to either mute until I get to the screen after this, or otherwise you want to just listen on headphones. But effectively, Albertine is run by this guy. And when we called him up and we said to him, what do you actually do in order to earn the fees that you get? What does business development entail when you're procuring from the state? This is what he told us.
Susan, just play that again. Is it playing on your side? Susan?
Hang on a sec.
Susan, just pause that. Can you unshare your screen and reshare it? But before you share it, click on share audio, computer audio.
Okay. Let me just do that. Sorry, guys. Share computer sound. There we go. Okay. Can you guys otherwise hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Let's try. Okay.
We're having a DA agenda with our party spies. The DA wants to take control of the country. We understand all of this. Stupid. So you think you're doing a good job. You don't have a husband, you don't have children. That's why you do what you do.
I think what we're really trying to get to the bottom of, you have companies like McKinsey, who are foreign companies coming into South Africa and taking huge amounts of money from the state.
Put me on record. amaBhungane is creating civil war. Put me on record now. Put in your fucking article. I don't give a fuck. I've got no money. I've got nothing left. Right? So fuck you. I've spent it all on lawyers because of you cunts. We did the work. We got the business. What the fuck?
The work that you performed for them, what does that actually entail? Because they weren't willing to tell us that.
I'm not going to also tell you because you're a fucking newspaper. You're not court of law. Oh, you understand business development. So let me explain. So when took us to Leopard Creek, spent the whole weekend there. Free clothes, free food, plane tickets, free plane tickets, paid for by that's called business development. Then you give you alcohol, you fucking do whatever, drink as much as you want. That's called business development. Okay. When the MT flies every businessman, every politician, I hope you're recording this, to Durban, to Zimbabwe, paid for, chicks, alcohol, clothes, whatever. You know what that's called, Susan?
Business development?
It's called business development.
So that's just to give you an idea of the kind of thing, how quickly, you move from a really reputable company, a really, a huge contract with a reputable company like McKinsey, into some really strange and really questionable places where the question is still unanswered about what work that company was actually doing. Now, I'm running out of time a little bit, so I'm not time, but I want to just quickly take you to another example of the same thing. SAP, global software giant based in Germany and in the US, one of the biggest software companies in the world. Now, they also have a pattern of paying business development partners. But whereas the Guptas and Regiments were doing this in a very hidden way, in a way that, and I think I should just mention this, that McKinsey says they didn't know about these contracts. SAP does it agree, and you'll see here on the third line where it says, basically, the consultant will get paid if they are the effective cause of SAP getting a massive contract. And those are often contracts with the state. Now, what they're being paid was we've seen between 10% of the contract value and 30% of the contract value for being the effective cause. Now, the thing is, when we went to SAP and we asked them, what do these guys do? The particular company we were asking them about was a company called CAD House. They sell 3D printers. And the response that we got from the CFO, the SAP CFO, was basically, if you read here, we were looking at doing 3D models for these guys to show them the value and benefit of using our solution. And so what we basically said to them, but they're specialists in selling 3D printers. What do you mean you were going to give them 15% of the value of the contract for making 3D models? And as you'll see, I mean, as we kept pushing them and saying, but what does this company do? What did they do to earn this massive amount of money? Effectively, what we ended up getting from SAP was where you have the head of legal saying to us, look, you have the CFO and the SAP head of legal in front of you. We can't get into the details about what they did. And what we said to them is, that's insane. If you're paying these companies, sometimes hundreds of millions of rands, you have to actually be able to answer the question, wait, what do they actually do in order to earn that money? I'm not going to go into this, but this was a memo, an internal memo describing how SAP knew how risky the contracts were. I'm also aware we might have some colleagues who are listening in from other African countries. So this is just something I wanted to bring to your attention. There was an affidavit filed recently by the former CFO of SAP Africa. And he had said in 2016, he had gone and warned SAP globally that every public sector contract within the SAP Africa region was being procured with the help of business development partners, which means that there were huge commissions being paid on every single public sector contract, according to him. Now, to a degree, SAP has stopped that process. You'll see on the right here, this is the transparency perceptions of corruption perception index. And basically, they've stopped this process for any countries that fall below 50%. That still means that Namibia and Botswana, both of you still fall within the range that they could still be paying business development fees in your countries. Also, I've put together this list on the left. These are deals that I was aware of SAP pursuing in other African countries in around 2015, 2017, around there. I don't know which ones of those were eventually signed, but if they're public sector deals, particularly public sector deals on this list, I would be going to every single one of those and asking SAP, did you pay business development commissions on any of these contracts? Because based on the affidavit from the former CFO, there's a very good chance that you're going to find the same thing that we found in South Africa happening in your own countries as well. Okay, I'm going to wrap up because I'm a little bit over time already, but I just wanted to say that I know it's incredibly difficult to investigate huge corporates. My colleagues can probably tell you horror stories about some of the tactics that private companies will use to go after journalists and to try and dissuade you from publishing your stories. What I'd say though is that, you know, these companies that have these kind of unassailable reputations, these untouchable kind of reputations, well, those reputations are there until one day they're not. Until one day a journalist comes along and starts asking difficult questions. Okay, that's where I'm going to finish. Thanks, guys.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. Okay, so the next speaker is me. So I'll be taking you through some access to information tips and tricks. And just to introduce myself, I am the advocacy coordinator at amaBhungane. So I am a lawyer by training, but am now assisting amaBhungane with their advocacy, which I'll also be talking about a little bit later, but also just kind of wrangling these legal issues and questions that come up. So what I'm going to be doing now is I'm just going to share my presentation. If you just give me 1 second. Okay, so what I'm going to be discussing here is how to get records through the Promotion of Access to Information Act, or PAIA, as well as the Companies Act, and then also just a few tips on how to get court records. Now, this is all from a very South African perspective, but I think that there's been a lot of movement and advocacy to ensure that there is dedicated access to information, or ATI, legislation across the continent. So I will be discussing advocacy a little bit later, but I also just want to make the point that although we are fortunate to have dedicated access to information legislation in South Africa, it's far from perfect. You might recall last week, AIJC had a discussion on revisions to PAIA itself, and we ourselves are also involved in advocacy to amend the Companies Act to provide for beneficial ownership transparency. So it's an ongoing process, but this is kind of the state of play at the moment. And so I'll just be going through some of these laws and methods to get information that'll assist with your investigations. So just turning to the Promotion of Access to Information Act, this is just going to be a step-by-step. So I think the first step that's quite important is to get the PAIA manual. Every company, private or public, is supposed to have one of these by law. Go onto the website to find it. If it's not there, you should phone the company and try to get their public facing representative to send you that information. It's important because it's got the contact details of the information officer, or IO, and the deputy information officer, and it'll have their designated contact details there, and you must use that. So although you might be dealing with somebody else, like a media liaison or someone else from the company, when you're submitting your PAIA request, you must send it to the information, to the details that are contained in the PAIA manual itself. So your next step is to complete the relevant form. And the first question you need to ask yourself is the entity from which I'm seeking the information a public or private body? And sometimes it's not always clear. So what you do in those cases is you go back to the PAIA manual, it should be stated there. So the main difference between requesting information from a public or a private body is that where you're requesting from a private body, you need to state the right which you seek to exercise or protect. And you also need to say why the record is necessary for the protection or exercise of that right. So I'm just going to take you through an example here. This is from one of the PAIA requests that I made on behalf of amaBhungane, but I've just swapped out the names just so that it's not mentioning amaBhungane especially. So this is the kind of information that I've included. The first thing that you do is you'd state that you're a member of the media and what it is you do. So here we investigate and expose corruption. Then it's helpful to refer to the relevant case law. So you'll see there's 3 cases that are listed here. This isn't all of them. You can find relevant case law that can really support and buttress your right. And then next, you'll need to show how the records that you request are necessary in order to further the public interest and, by extension, your right of freedom of expression as a member of the media. And you can conclude by saying that this is necessary to give effect to your right to freedom of expression, and this is why you need access to the record. So this doesn't exhaust the options, but it is a useful way for journalists to frame their requests if there isn't a more kind of specific or direct right that is personal to you. So this is just one suggested way that you can go about this. So, and just a note, if the information doesn't fit on the relevant form, you're welcome to put it in a separate annexure. So next idea to look at is how to describe the information you're requesting. So if you're looking for a specific document, obviously you can use its name, but also have as much identifying information as you can. So who was the author, when was it published, even if you know the number of pages, that will really help to narrow it down. But sometimes you might want to cast the net a little bit wider. And I think in that it is useful to do so, but you also need to be careful that you don't hit section 45, which states that requests can be refused if manifestly frivolous or vexatious, or the fulfillment would substantially or unreasonably divert the resources of the public body. So you can't request all records ever created on a particular matter. You need to cast the net wide, but also include some parameters. So dates, timeframes, geographic specifications, these are things that you can do to narrow down the field slightly, but still be able to kind of catch things that you may not be specifically aware about. And just remember to ask for relevant information as well. So if you're asking for a list of companies that were awarded a tender, ask for their CIPC registration numbers as well, so that you can continue your investigation using that information. So just be mindful to include all of that on your form. I'm going to go through these very quickly. You should have a cover letter, which basically states who you are. If you're acting on behalf of someone else, you should say that, as well as attach a letter of authorization as well. And you should tender the payment of fees. Then you send your relevant form, which is Form A or Form C, with your cover letter to the information officer and deputy information officer, as I mentioned. It's useful to include a read receipt. So if you can request a delivery and a read receipt, that is very helpful. And in your letter, ask for an acknowledgement of receipt. And I think that if it eventually goes that the case, if the PI request becomes a subject of litigation later, it's useful to have all of these confirmations. So once the request has been sent, they have 30 calendar days in which to respond, unless the last day falls on a Sunday or a public holiday, in which case it's the next business day. It's very important to remember that. Okay, so what happens after that, once you've sent your request? Well, they can either send the requested records, great, nothing left to do. They can send some of the requested records, but not others. So that's known as a partial refusal. They'll need to give you reasons for that refusal. And you can appeal the refusal using the methods which apply, which also applies in respect of denying the request and sending the reasons. The options for appeal, either if it's a public body, it can be to an internal. There's an internal appeal mechanism included in PIA, or if it's a private body, then you would need to go to court. They can also extend the time period within which to make the request. So that can be another further 30 days, but there's specified grounds in which they can do that. Likewise, for the case of deferral of access, there's also a list of specified grounds in PIA, something like, there's a proceedings that are yet to be concluded, but they'll provide the information after that's been done. They can also say that the records can't be found or don't exist, in which case they'll need to supply an affidavit stating all the steps that they took to locate that record. Or they can do nothing. And so if they simply ignore your request after 30 days, that is called a deemed refusal, and you can follow the appeal processes for that as well. So turning quickly to the Companies Act, Section 26(2) of the Companies Act of 2008 says that any member of the public is entitled to inspect or copy the register of shareholders or directors or members. So the form that you use to do this is called the COR 24 form. And it's quite a simple process. All you basically need for that to fill out this form is the company's name, CIPC registration number, and their contact details. So you fill out that form with that information. Attach a cover letter as well in this instance. Many times companies are have not dealt with this process before. They never had this request made of them, especially if it's a small company. So what we do on our cover letter is to include just refer to the section that we're invoking in requesting this information. We state that it's an obligation to provide this information. And we also say they've got 14 business days in which to respond. And we also just note that it's an offense if they fail to comply. So I think that's a helpful guide for them. Sometimes companies will come back and say, tell us why. Why do you want this information? You don't have to give them a reason. You basically have an entitlement to request this information from the company. So if they do so, you can just remind them that they have a statutory obligation to provide the information. And if they don't, there's steps that you can take. I think first it's useful to engage first before trying to go for the nuclear options of enforcement. Just try to write back to them and explain to them, and maybe there's somebody who will understand and you'll get it easier that way. But if they still refuse, then you can lodge a complaint with the CIPC. The relevant form is COR 135.1. And in that regard, when what is helpful there as well, because you'll need to prove that you sent the request to the company. If you've got those read and delivery receipts or an acknowledgement of receipt from the company, then that is all the information that will go into your complaint to show that you did indeed deliver the request, and now there's been no luck. The only issue with this process is that it is absolutely painfully slow. It may take months to get a result, but the CIPC can issue an enforcement notice that will basically you call upon the company, CIPC calls upon the company to comply. Okay, so I'm just going to go to court records very quickly. Just to note that access to court records is a very important part of open justice. So we've got City of Cape Town versus Sanral, where the Supreme Court of Appeal observed that all court records are by default public documents. They're open to public scrutiny at all times. And also any departure from this rule is an exception and must be justified. So I think that is a very important principle and a useful principle for anyone who wants to report on the activities of the court. So when it comes to requesting information from the courts, there's no magic or formal procedure. Pre-COVID-19, if you wanted to access court records, you'd simply go down to the court and go to the relevant records office and ask the official there to uplift the records. Courts operate at varying degrees of efficiency, so that experience could vary a lot. It's easier and more difficult to get the records. Of course, now we're in the era of COVID-19, and it's become much more difficult to get access to the court records. But helpfully, some courts are moving towards digitization. So one where it's fairly simple to get the records, it's the Constitutional Court. They've obviously got a far lower volume of cases, so they're able to do this. But you simply go onto the Constitutional Court's website, you click on the relevant case, and you'll see somewhere it says open item record. And that's where you can get all the pleadings and papers in the case. In Gauteng, the case line system became mandatory in January of this year. So that means that not all the cases are uploaded onto this online document repository, but it is still a useful way to access records as a member of the public. So how you go about registering with case lines is you go to this website there that I've put the link onto the slide. Then you register a profile where they select type of member. I just selected lay member, and you'll get a confirmation email. So once your profile is created, then the next step that you'll need is to be invited to the case that you want to view. So in order to do that, you can contact the court registrar, but the far better way to do this is to contact the case line support number, which you see over there. The information that you'll need to provide is the case number. So they can't identify the case using the parties alone. But when you do ask to be invited to the case, they will ask you to confirm using the parties. So rather have that information on hand as well. So once you've been invited to the case, there you go. You can go onto the profile and view all the records there, download them, OCR them. It's a very useful system. So what if the court that you're looking at doesn't have an electronic system? Well, I don't have any kind of easy answers for you there, pick up the phone and try to call the court. If they do answer, which is not always the case, you can ask them to potentially uplift the file themselves and scan and send it to you. We've had a bit of luck with that, where the cases, where the volume of the records has not been too voluminous, but where it's been quite a big and a large set of papers, we've been asked to come into the court and view and inspect them and copy them at the court itself. So you'll have to make a plan in that sense. I hope these tips have been useful, and I'll see you a little bit later for the next presentation on journalism and the law. Thanks. Okay, great. So now we're going to go to our next speaker, which is Dewald. And Dewald's going to be doing a case study. Okay, Dewald, you can take it away.
Hi there. Good morning. I'm going to do a fairly small and innocuous case study, and I've chosen this one because it has the special characteristic of relying entirely of publicly available information, no leaks whatsoever. Let me just share my screen. The story in question is this one. It involves a fairly well-known local businessman called Iqbal Survey. He owns and controls the largest newspaper publishing group in the country, and a couple of other things besides. What I'm going to speak about is a fairly small part of a far larger investigation into his kind of corporate empire. The reason we're interested in him is that he has received 4.3 billion rand investment into a company he controls called IO Technology Solutions. And he got this money in a remarkably irregular way, and he got it from a state entity called the Public Investment Corporation, which invests pension funds for civil servants. Now, this money was invested at a price that had no relationship to the actual value of the company. The PIC CEO at the time was a friend of Survey's, so it's just dodgy on every front. So now we have this company with this money it really shouldn't have. And the idea of the investigation is to see how it's getting used. There's a general pattern. This money has been used to subsidize Survey's other companies, even though there's no logical connection between them. It's been used to channel money to friends by buying their companies to a large extent, and also funding your own stuff, which is almost always the case. So one element of this story involves about 130 million, which is a small part of the 4.3 billion, but nonetheless used in an instructive way. So it was used to buy something which seems to be completely worthless, and moreover, it's tied to Survey's personal assistant. So here's how we figured this one out. In IO, IO is a publicly listed corporation on the stock exchange. So its annual reports and financial statements are freely available. And so from its annual statements, we see that it is it's very proud of an investment it made into something called 4+ Technology Venture Fund Africa, which sounds incredibly impressive and supposedly has all this interest in artificial intelligence and all sorts of things related to the fourth industrial revolution. And they paid 75 million rand for 10% of this thing. So demonstrably, it's a terrible investment. It was immediately written down for 70 million rand. You can see that. So the 75 million they spent is actually worth 5 million. And that's immediate. They bought it and immediately it was written down. But that didn't stop them. They then went and paid 62.6 million to buy another 5%, which means they spent over 130 million rand for something worth probably 7.5 million rand. So you have to ask yourself, why are they throwing good money after bad? Why pay so much for something worthless? So the way they describe 4+ is to say, well, it has this investment in something called Vault Africa, and then a couple of other things. So what exactly is Vault Africa? So just Google the thing and you see there's a problem already. You get an ad site for recruiting employees that describes Vault Africa, and the description is that it's a service provider to independent media, which is owned by Iqbal Survey. So essentially, he has had IO give 130 million rand to an unrelated company providing services to one of his unrelated companies. That is an abuse of the PIC money. Then, in order to kind of understand who owned this company providing the services to independent, we use one of the tools that Cherise was still talking about just now, which is the COR24 form, which is immensely important when you're researching private companies. So here's what we did. First of all, we made a request to get the shareholding of this company Vault, and then also its owner 4+. But let's start with the subsidiary Vault first. First thing you see is it not only serves independent, it actually was part of it. So the document you get back, you see Independent Digital Labs scratched out and the new name Vault Africa. It was part of Iqbal Survey's group. Further down in the same document that they had to give us, you see that it was owned by Sagamata Technologies, 100% owned by Iqbal Survey. Then from there, you see here with red arrow is that it was sold or transferred at some undeclared price or value to something called Apollos Millennial Investments. We don't know what that is at all, but it changed its name at some point to become 4+ Technology Venture Fund Africa. So that's how it ended up being owned by this company that IO paid 130 million rand for. It went from being independent media lab to becoming 4+ Technology Venture Fund. Okay, so what we know by now, using, again, only public tools, is that IO spent all this money on a fairly worthless investment in this thing called 4+. We know that 4+ is actually indirectly an investment in Vault Africa, which we know is a service provider to another survey company. So now that we know who owns Vault, which is being 4+, which was Apollos Millennium, who actually owns 4+, who was given the 130 million rand. So we COR24 that one as well. And the owner is Heidi Apollos. We have no idea who Heidi Apollos is. So we Google around and we find that she is the sister of Trisha Apollos. Trisha is Iqbal Survey's personal assistant. So clearly, Iqbal Survey has found a way to fund a company belonging to someone he knows. So we went to Heidi. We had asked her to, we gave this, the request for shareholding to her initially. And she told us what her address is, where to send things. And that address was the silo development at the V&A waterfront in Cape Town. It is an incredibly exclusive, expensive residential development. It's 24 million rand for an apartment. The apartment she cited happens to belong to Iqbal Survey and his sisters. It's a private company. It has nothing to do with IO. So now we have him investing in a company owned by a person who's his personal assistant's sister who lives in his apartment. And then that very self-same apartment is owned indirectly through a company called ProDirect, which is getting its rent paid or its bond paid off by IO. So you really have an incredibly multifaceted way in which money is being abused, money that was invested by a state organ into this guy's company. You see that it's 130 million rand and basically stuck into something worthless, but which nonetheless belongs to the personal assistant of the man in control of the investment. serving what purpose, God knows what. And you can, all of this is demonstrable using only public financial statements, your R24 requests. To figure out who owned that flat, we went to the deeds office, quick little search there, and then a bunch of phone calls to figure out who the policisters are. And that's that. No leaks, nothing secretive, but nonetheless a fun investigation into the use of essentially public money. Right, that's me for now.
Thanks so much. I think at this point, if anyone has any questions for Dewald, you can put them in the chat. We can also wait to address some questions a little bit later. But if we don't have any questions at the moment, then we're going to move on to our next speaker, which is Micah. So Micah has worked for the Right to Know campaign. He studied at Oxford University and he's worked internationally in the Middle East before joining amaBhungane in 2017. Thanks, Micah.
Thanks, Cherise. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a sort of lightning tour of our EFF Metro corruption investigation. And this is basically a story about how the EFF, and it applies to other political parties. This is not the sort of exclusive preserve of the EFF, but it's a case study in how a party inserts itself into public procurement in the metros and municipalities and plays the role of a gatekeeper, basically shaking down anyone who wants to do business with government, with the metros or municipalities. Just for a bit of context, and I think it's fairly important, is to understand a little bit about the history and the sort of political economy of procurement in South Africa. You can all see that fine, eh? So at the heart of that is the rise of the contract state. And in South Africa, procurement has become a vehicle for sort of class formation. We disparagingly refer to tenderpreneurs, but actually, I mean, it plays a critical role in the creation of a new middle class. Pre-94, similar things were happening in different ways. The state and SOEs were used to create and to sort of consolidate a white Afrikaner middle class. But that sort of configuration has changed. And here, the usual disclaimers apply. It's not in any way to like wish away apartheid corruption, but it is different now. Corruption looks different. Corruption works somewhat differently, especially when you're talking about state procurement. So that configuration has changed, and increasingly what we see globally and in SA is that is a sort of new, what they call new management, new public management taking hold, where the state is increasingly run along business lines, and you get the contract state where key functions of the state are increasingly outsourced to private players. And the sums are pretty staggering. I think the last figure I heard was like R1 trillion a year is spent on procurement alone. And here you can see on the graph, procurement as a percentage of GDP, and a fairly steady rise over time. Procurement itself has also become a lot more politicized. So where previously you had a sort of corporatist arrangement, you'd have state tender boards, and on those boards sat various different actors. You'd have the private sector, you'd have it, in the form of industry bodies and professional associations, you'd have politicians, officials, a range of different groups sitting on these bodies, and kind of, to some extent, keeping each other in check. And now what we see is dedicated supply chain units within procuring entities, and there's over 1,000 such procuring entities in South Africa. Now, ostensibly these are sort of dedicated supply chain units. They're professionalized. There are all sorts of checks and balances to keep politics out, ostensibly. So, to prevent politicians interfering or having a sort of say in supply chain. So on paper, it sounds sort of more professionalized and more insulated from political interference, but that just isn't the case, because it interacts with HR. human resources. And human resources is something that has been overtly politicized since the ANC came into power. And that was a deliberate attempt to kind of take control of a state that was seen as reactionary and as a major impediment to the ANC's transformation agenda. And so we have cadre deployment, we have officials appointed by politicians, so if you look at the city of Joburg, for instance, it is the politicians who are calling the shots over appointments at metro entities. If politicians can control key appointments in supply chain, that gives them quite a lot of scope to influence supply chain. And then with the emergence of coalition governments, with the EFF coming into power, as sort of de facto kingmakers. So they had outsized influence in places like Tshwane and Joburg by virtue of being kingmakers in council. And in Johannesburg, the DA relied on the EFF, even though the EFF wasn't in formal coalition with the DA. The DA's margins were so slim that they relied on the EFF as voting partners, and that, of course, led to a big split in the DA that we've seen playing out recently. So the story began with the Joburg Roads Agency contract, which was a fairly minor bridge. I mean, we're talking, I think it was tens of millions, upwards of 100 million eventually. But it was relatively minor in the bigger scheme of things. But we'd heard that this M1 bridge contract was being fiddled, basically. There was a whole lot of political influence. And the managing director was very sort of publicly removed. He made quite a stink about it at the time. And he basically drew attention to a project management unit. He was saying, I'll get to that in a bit, but he was basically saying that the board was leaning very heavily on him and others and trying to involve itself in tender decisions. Of course, the board is supposed to steer clear of that. It's supposed to be an organization. It's supposed to be an oversight body. But this MD was saying that the board was really overstepping the mark, and the political portfolio responsible for the JRA had basically been handed to the IFP as the DA's coalition partners in Joburg. And so they were allegedly maneuvering to put their people in charge. They'd basically cleaned out the board and put IFP loyalists in the board. And there were all sorts of red flags, in particular around this bridge contract. And initially there was an underperforming contractor on the bridge that was supposed to be revamping it. It was apparently increasingly unsafe. And so the contractor who'd been brought in was just not doing its work. And the board was sort of increasingly reluctant to remove this contractor, despite its poor performance. The board didn't seem to want it gone anytime soon. Managers were making a big fuss about it, but the board just dragged its feet and got in the way. And then a sort of fabricated emergency came about where they suddenly needed to appoint someone because this contractor hadn't done the job, and it was becoming increasingly a sort of health and safety concern. And so they used a sort of trick in the book to bypass a competitive procurement process, and they brought in a politically connected contractor, massively inflated the prices, paid an irregular down payment to this new contractor. And we could show all of this through tender documents. We could see that the prices were inflated. We could see this down payment from internal records. And we could see the sort of attempt to bypass a competitive bid. But how does one actually go about obtaining these records? And that's a trickier thing. So there has been a move towards greater transparency, and there is a central supplier database. So companies that do business with the state are supposed to be registered and on the supplier database. A lot of the time that is breached. So companies that aren't on the database still manage to get contracts. compliance levels are relatively low. There's supposed to be an e-tender portal. So tenders that are advertised are supposed to be posted on this Treasury portal. It's all supposed to be centralized. It's supposed to show when tenders are advertised, when they're awarded, when they're cancelled. Again, that's something that's often observed more in the breach than in conformity. And it's just a very patchy thing. And so like City of Tshwane will have its own tender portal. Some tenders just never get put on any portal. They're very opaque. So it's hard to rely on that. And then that only gives you certain documents. So you'll see the adverts and you'll see announcements of awards, but you won't see all the kind of internal tender documents, the sort of various committees that the tender will go through. Usually there'll be, there'll normally be all sorts of documents associated with each phase of the process, but you won't get all of that online. And so often you'd have to rely on PIA. Of course, that can be cumbersome, time-consuming, tricky in its own way. But generally, we've relied on insider sources, and at least these tender documents do get quite widely circulated within an administration. So you have the various committees, and various people sit on those committees, and so these things do have a way of traveling. But much more than the IFP, we'd heard that the EFF were really raking it in the metros. Again, because they were kingmakers and they were really flexing their political muscles to get influence in tenders. And so we'd heard that they were having a real say in who was getting appointed, and that they were getting kickbacks, and they were really involving themselves quite heavily. And we'd heard about this fleet deal to supply the city's sort of the backbone of its fleet, and that was a deal worth over R1 billion. And the rumor was that the EFF were leveraging their political influence to try and influence this deal so that they could swing it to a favored service provider. And we'd heard about staff being purged. We'd heard also that at the heart of this was a sort of was wrangling around the city's budget, and that the EFF were refusing to go along with Mashaba unless he basically offered some sort of quid pro quo. We were never really able to entirely firm up this sort of budget fight, but that was the allegation. Anyway, we did get hold of a number of very useful tender documents showing that that there was initially a tendering process for a new contract, and the incumbent on that contract was Avis, and they were firmly in the lead to get the contract again, followed by a number of other service providers. And the company we were interested in, AfriRent, scored relatively low, so it came quite low down on the rankings. And then we could see that eventually the whole thing was sort of scuppered. They decided that there was a relatively minor technicality, and they decided to cancel the tender. And we could see from the tender documents that was a little bit suspicious. It looked like it was a tender that didn't necessarily need to be cancelled, that this was a technicality that could have been ironed out fairly quickly. And again, it looked like a sort of deliberate disaster, something that was self-inflicted, so that they could use a so-called Section 32 to bypass a competitive bid again. So that entails piggybacking on another state's contract. Basically, what City of Joburg did is they went out to look for another organ of state that had a particular contract. In this case, it was Mogale City, a much smaller municipality, had a small contract with AfriRent, this company we were interested in. And so they picked AfriRent off this contract and basically switched. They used the Mogale contract for themselves. Joburg used the Mogale contract. Totally ill-suited, much smaller, and these things have to be motivated, properly motivated. So when Section 32 is used, the policy is that the contract that is being piggybacked off has to pretty much be the same. The specs have to be pretty much the same. The requirements need to be pretty much the same as the requirements of the new contracting entity. But in this case, it was pretty farcical. It was a obscure little contract. And in parallel, I can't really get into this, but in parallel, we came across evidence of payments from that contractor, AfriRent, that was handpicked by the city without the competitive bid. We saw payments from them into the account of Mahuna. Now, Mahuna, for those of you who followed the VBS scandal, that may that may have a familiar ring to it, because Mahuna was the sort of front company fronted by one of Malema's cousins that was used to channel all sorts of illicit money to Malema. And you can see, you know, the timing here is pretty curious. So, you know, 25th of July, we see 300,000 Rand going to Mahuna. The day after that 300,000 Rand payment, AfriRent sends a proposal to the city that they use this Section 32 appointment bypassing a competitive bid. Then again, the next month, another 200,000 Rand. In October, AfriRent is formally appointed. That was our first story in the series. And that led to a forensic probe. Cherise, I'm a bit mindful of time, so feel free to cut me off, but I'll see how far I can get in the meantime. That led to a forensic probe. There was a whole lot of pressure on the city to do something, you know, to investigate this suspicious tender. But the problem with the probe is that, you know, when it eventually came out, it was clear that it was a very shallow investigation. They just looked at the tender processes. They didn't really look at any of the sort of back end of corruption that we'd raised in our report. And you know, what it also underscored is just how easy it is to make procurement processes look above board, right? These are now sort of box ticking exercises. They're not the sort of deliberative exercises that you had under the old tender boards, where there was, you know, discussion and various sort of parties weighing things up and all those sort of internal counterbalances where you had sort of different groupings sitting on these boards deliberating. Now it's very much a procedural thing. It's a lot of box ticking, and all it takes is a few, you know, manipulatable officials in supply chain to be able to, you know, create these sorts of emergencies, these you know, pretexts for things like Section 32 appointments. And there are enough loopholes and sort of gray areas in the regulations that it's easy enough to kind of sort of game the system. And as I said, it is a fairly politicized process after all, because the MMC appoints the boards, you know, the politicians appoint the boards find, you know, any reason in the book to try and kind of reshuffle stuff and put in their own people. AfriRent had an alibi that I would like to get into if there's time, but Cherise, how am I doing? Sorry, I see messages. Just one sec. Okay, cool. So AfriRent, this company that had paid kickbacks to the Malema front company, excuse me. Their excuse was, you know, that they didn't deny paying the money to Mahuna, but their justification for it was that was money related to another contract. It had nothing to do with the fleet deal. They'd paid Mahuna in connection to a Department of Rural Development contract, and they said that they'd paid Mahuna for translation services, for, you know, to be a sort of, to help them with implementing this contract, which was basically to provide farming equipment and tractors to rural communities. And it at first seemed like a somewhat plausible alibi. And so we thought, okay, well, let's try and, you know, the obvious thing was to try and poke holes in this. So we decided, we had a look around for what leads we had. And there wasn't much, right? AfriRent wasn't giving us information on their contract. We were really struggling to find out more about this Limpopo deal that was the pretext for those payments. But on their website, they did have a few interesting little leads. So they had a little kind of glossy brochure section where they showed all the great work they were doing. They showcased, you know, what they were doing in the Eastern Cape and other parts of the country. And there were 3 interesting little photos labeled Chakuma Village, Limpopo, September 2018. So it seemed safe to assume that that was that had to do with their Limpopo land reform contract. And so we thought, okay, well, we should track down these beneficiaries to see if indeed Mahuna played any role. But we didn't have very much to go on. We had these 3 photos, so we tried to figure out where this was. Chakuma Village turns out is not much of a village. It's a sort of sprawling peri-urban area outside Thohoyandou. But we managed to cross-reference one of the pics with Google Earth and sort of figured out roughly where this would be, and went there. And with the help of a few locals, you know, by the evening we got there, we were able to find this place and track down this man featured on the website. And sure enough, he hadn't heard anything about Mahuna. But that was one of many beneficiaries. And so we went back to the department, and it was like, I mean, they were initially sort of stonewalling, or it was like getting, you know, information from a rock. And they just weren't giving us, you know, a lot of government departments can be extremely unresponsive, but they weren't giving us the information we wanted. This is the Department of Land Reform. We wanted a full list of the beneficiaries of this project so we could speak to them about this mysterious Mahuna. And we got very little from them initially, but after a lot of begging and pleading and then threatening pyre, we eventually got the list that we were looking for. And it included a long list of sort of cooperatives and little farming organizations in Limpopo dotted around the province. And each one we spoke to said they had had no interaction with Mahuna. None of them knew of this Mahuna. So by that stage, we thought, okay, well, that seems like an alibi that is severely lacking. And I think we were pretty sure of our case by then. And that Mahuna was just a front to receive these kickbacks from AfriRent. But perhaps the most clear-cut example of just how easy it is to sort of cook the tender books by having the right people on the inside was our Tshwane fuel tender story. And again, there were allegations that the tender was rigged in the EFF's favor, that again in Tshwane it was kind of kingmaker, and it was calling the shots in many ways in around procurement. And that there was, everywhere you looked, there were allegations of the EFF influencing tenders in the metro, and it was sort of so extensive and seemed so conspiratorial at times. It was hard to separate the chaff from the wheat, kind of thing. But the AfriRent story had led to more leaks, and we heard that the fuel tender. We'd heard that the fuel tender had gone to, it had been split up and given to 3 winners, three service providers that allegedly had political links. And it was the incumbent on the previous fuel tender was given a cut along with 2 other companies. It was a very lucrative tender. And we got a whole lot, again, through a leak, we got a whole lot of tender documents. And I passed them on to Stefans as soon as I got them. Stefans and I did the story. And, within a moment, his sort of bullshit radar was pinging. And he picked up a very obvious anomaly in the scoring of the tender. So, they weight very heavily when scoring bidders. These committees weight very heavily the price score. So they'll weigh up all the different prices of potential service providers of the various bidders, and they'll give them a score. And in this case, they had asked bidders to provide prices on 6 different types of fuel, whereas the city, in actual fact, only required 2 types of fuel. They only required higher grade diesel and unleaded 95, but they'd asked bidders to supply prices for all of these. So, I mean, if basically here's how it would work if you were gaming the system, if you had inside information as the incumbent, and one of the, at least one of the winning service providers had, then you would know to come in sort of impossibly low on categories of fuel that you knew the city didn't need. So LRP 93, for instance, the city didn't use any of it, or ULP 93. So you come in very low on those prices and very, very high on prices, because you're going to make a spectacular profit here, on prices for fuel that the city did need. And there were only two categories that it used. So BBT, which was this politically linked company that paid kickbacks to EFF leaders, came in with the highest score and won the largest share of the contract. And that just shows, I mean, so if the city were doing things properly, they would, you know, the logical thing to do in a competitive bid process like this to make it fair would be to weight the different categories of fuel according to what the city's needs were. Of course, it didn't do that. It just added all the different categories up per bidder and gave an average non-weighted score, which is a, you know, plainly ridiculous way of going about things. And then we were able to show that that BBT that was one of the three winning bidders, again, was paying Mahuna Investments and DMM Media and Entertainment, a company linked to the EFF's new Secretary General, Marshall Dlamini, paying pretty large round figure sums at key processes, key points, in the tender process. There was a proviso in the tender documents that the city would negotiate down would negotiate the prices down to the lowest figure provided by the bidders, but that just didn't happen. So the city was massively overpaying for fuel and effectively subsidizing BBT's kickbacks. We were also able to show that the EFF, that the winning bidder, BBT, had a man on the inside. We're able to trace all these links that you can see here, but crucially, a person who was instrumental in supply chain was actually the brother of BBT's owner. And that's it for now. I think I've just run out of time, so.
Okay, so now we'll be moving on to Stefan's Brummer. I think if I had to kind of read all Stefan's achievements, we'd be here for the whole afternoon. But just to summarize, he's been a journalist since the early 90s. He's worked for the Mail and Guardian. He co-founded amaBhungane in 2010, and he's now the managing partner who keeps us all in check. And as Micah says, has a formidable bullshit detector. So Stefan will be talking to us now about local corruption. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, let me try and do the screen share thing. And this is really about quite an egregious saga of corruption related to the procurement of locomotives by Transnet, which is the state rail company. This all happened in a time of state capture. State capture, for those who are not from here, is the process by which private interests would get their hands on the levers of state power and monetize that. So this is a little lesson in following the money. I don't have much time, so we won't get into too much of the intricate detail, but if anyone is interested, please feel free to contact me directly if you need any more about the how-tos of this. So we're looking at two stories here, a main story and a detailed story about how the Guptas, who were the private interests in this case, who had gotten their hands onto state capture, onto the levers of state, how they had monetized this shopping spree that Transnet, the rail company, had gone on for locomotives. Late 2011 is when Transnet had started buying locomotives. We're talking altogether up to about 100 billion rands worth of locomotives that it had commissioned to buy as part of a kind of a very ambitious rail revitalization project. As things turned out, quite a bit of that was unnecessary. They were far too ambitious about how rail traffic would in fact grow. But of course, it served those who wanted to put out huge contracts and to toll them. And this is really a story about how the Guptas had tolled those contracts. What I mean by tolling is how you use your access to state power to monetize. So to put it into a simple diagram for you, here are the Guptas, here are the politicians. The politicians deploy malleable officials to Transnet. The Guptas, on whose behalf these officials are being deployed to Transnet, can instruct those officials. So Transnet has been captured in consort by the politicians and the Guptas. The Guptas are the master brains. They give the orders. Transnet officials, whoops, I think I've just, there we go. Transnet officials award contracts to favored companies. In these stories, CRRC Corporation was the beneficiary group. It originally at the time consisted of CNR and CSR Secretarial groups in China, but they subsequently merged to form CRRC and become the biggest rail equipment company in the world. So CRRC gets the contracts, and CRRC has to return the favor by paying kickbacks to the Guptas. And to close the circle, of course, the Guptas are going to be looking after the politicians and the officials at Transnet. So to get back to our stories, let's look at the actual stories on browser. So here was the main story. We reveal 9 billion. So to put it in a nutshell, here's a table of contracts that Transnet had handed out to CRRC companies. 1995 locomotives in 2012, and then another 100 locomotives, and then 359 and 232, and then more money for relocating the manufacturing facilities, and then a big maintenance contract. Altogether, almost 42 billion rands of contracts from Transnet to these CRRC companies. What our story showed was that these CRRC companies had agreed to pay 9 billion rands worth of kickbacks to the Guptas and their associates. Now you can see that's quite a significant percentage. That's over 20%, 1/5 of what Transnet paid these companies. They had to pay the Guptas in turn. What our stories could also show was that at least 3.7 billion of the 9 billion had been paid by late 2016. After that, much of the data unfortunately went dark, so there's no reason to believe we did not get close to the 9 billion, but at least we can prove that 3.7 billion was paid. Our background story, the detailed story, came with a bit of a health warning, and it's the same health warning that I need to give you now. Not for the faint-hearted. It gets rather intricate to follow money in this way. What we did is we looked at things contract by contract, and you can see some pretty fancy graphics done by a colleague of mine. So here we look at the 95 locomotives contract. We look on the left at what Transnet paid to the Chinese company, and then we look at what kickbacks the Chinese company paid to the Guptas. You'll see nice pop-ups there showing exactly how much paid in each case. we can go through it, and then there's a contract for 100 locomotives. Again, this is what Transnet paid the Chinese company, what the Chinese company paid in each case as a kickback, and that would generally be 21%, etc. To get back to a little feature of our website I want to show you, the evidence docket. The evidence docket is very important for us for the simple reason that it allows us to take the reader, the public, into our confidence and vice versa. There's transparency from our side. What do we base our story, our findings on? So we show the actual underlying data. So you can see it, the evidence docket. If I click on that, this is what you're going to see. And there we go. Now, what we had in our evidence docket in this case was, I think, 8 kickback contracts. The actual contracts that had been signed between the CRRC companies and Gupta front companies. Of course, all of this happens offshore, Hong Kong, Dubai, offshore accounts, hidden money flows via front companies. But hidden or not, they can be quite blatant. So to show you one of these, now I seem to have a bandwidth problem because this thing is not popping up as it's supposed to. There we go. Let's go to, so you'll see, as Susan told you at the beginning of this masterclass, these contracts are often called business development service agreements. You know, it's never going to be called a kickback agreement. But what is the dead giveaway that the value for money does not add up? It's not value that was given. No one worked for this money, except if bribery and corruption is work. Let's look at the actual figures here. There you see. For the project-related advisory services provided by Tequesta, so that's a Hong Kong-based front company of the Guptas, Tequesta shall be entitled to an advisory fee of 21% of the contract value of Project 359. So 21% of these 359 locomotives being bought by Transnet, 21% of what Transnet pays the CRRC company in China is going to be forwarded as a kickback to the Guptas, and some detail of how it will happen. 2% as an initial success fee, and then 19% of each tranche. So if Transnet pays X billion for another 10 locomotives or whatever it may be, 19% of that is going to be forwarded by the supplier, by the equipment manufacturer, the locomotive company, to the Guptas. And a bit of extra information. Well, so much has already been paid into a different front company, blah, blah, blah. So quite a bit of information that we have there. But what we did was, let me just see if I can find what I was wanting to show you. Yeah. Okay, so really 3 types of information that we put together here, and sometimes you've got to be patient. It took us, I think, more than 2 years to gather all the bits and pieces to be able to do what we had set out to do here. Kickback contracts, in some instances, the kickback contracts were kind of what would you call it? So these will have the right word, but renewed, as it were. So then there's an accounting of what had already been paid. That was useful information, as was the information of what percentage of each Transnet tranche needed to be kicked back to the Guptas. Then there was information in the GuptaLeaks. The GuptaLeaks tranche of emails that we and others published as of 2017 from within the heart of the Gupta Empire. So there was a bit of accounting that we found in the GuptaLeaks about some of these kickbacks as well. And then, of course, leaked banking information, offshore banking information. There you see Habib Bank Limited statements from Dubai. If you can see, funnily enough, you can see CRRC paying three amounts there. That's US dollars, 2 million, 8 million, 9 million. So substantial money all paid over the course of 2-3 days there. Let us go back to the evidence docket. So you can see that's all there. It's presented. Where it all comes together is within this data analysis. The data analysis is what underlay all of these figures, and which enabled us to do the story that we had set out to do. Now, what exactly was it that we had set out to do? We wanted to prove that money had in fact been paid as kickbacks. We wanted to prove that certain financial flows that could be seen in bank statements, that these corroborated kickback contracts and what was seen in the GuptaLeaks. So really a conspectus of evidence, I think the lawyers will call it, a kind of a slam dunk case where you have different bits of information proving the other. So whereas I know for a fact that these kickback contracts that we've got, that they are the real thing, considering the source, we know where we got it. We can't expect you as the reader or an authority who one day needs to recover money for the public or prosecute guilty parties, we can't expect them to accept at face value that the kickback contract that we are presenting here is true. Neither can we expect a reader to take at face value that the bank statements that we say are true are in fact that. But once we can show that all of these things make sense, that they all corroborate each other, then you've got a pretty incontrovertible case. So what we did was, first of all, import as much data as you can. A spreadsheet is a very, very useful thing. So for example, what I had showed you previously, what we found in the GuptaLeaks, this accounting for some of the kickbacks, I put it in my spreadsheet in a tab. I put exchange rates over the years as published by the Reserve Bank. I put them in there. And this, of course, comes into play because once we...
You can think about wrapping up. Sorry.
I'll think about wrapping up. Are you actually seeing what... Are you seeing the spreadsheet?
Yes, just the side of it, yeah.
Good. Okay, right. Put all of that information together and essentially show that what we can see, Transnet paid in tranches, and this is published information, to the CRRC companies. Compare that with the expected tranche of the kickback as per the contract. Calculate from that what the expected rand kickback will be. Convert that using our exchange rate to dollars, because remember the kickbacks are now paid in dollars overseas. And then start matching that with information that we see in the GuptaLeaks information, in some of the accounting that we saw in the later kickback contracts, match that with what we see landing in bank accounts, and you'll see that the information, I could take you through this bit by bit, but Charisse is going to bite off my head. But you're going to see that information starts matching pretty clearly. So for example, here we had expected a kickback of 31,550,000 rands and 640. And there we've got a result of 635, only 5 rands out. So we can say with a high level of confidence that that is the expected kickback actually landing in an account. And so we can go on playing around a bit with different exchange rates. They fluctuate depending on the date. But in the end, we were able to show that 3.7 billion for us, which was up to the point where the data went dark, where the bank data went dark, that the 3.7 billion had been paid as envisaged in the kickback contracts. And that, as I say, helps to prove both sides of the equation. Very quickly, there we go. Why is this useful? Here's Shadow World Investigations, a non-profit, which had made a presentation to the Zondo Commission into state capture. And they had also set themselves the task of finding money. They came to the locomotive money. They simply said calculations conducted by amaBhungane have brilliantly illustrated blah, 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 and that they're not going to try and repeat that process. They also say that we believe the Commission has already reviewed this material, that accords with something which we had heard, that the National Prosecuting Authority in South Africa had also looked at our evidence docket and was also using the same material, our calculations. So what we had set out to do to show that here's a prosecutable case, a case where money can be recovered, public money can be recovered for the public. Certainly now others, including the relevant authorities, are running with that.
Thanks so much, Stefans. Okay, so now we're going back to Dewald. I didn't introduce Dewald properly earlier. So I just want to say that he's our business, economic, financial reporting wizard. He's worked at City Press before, and he joined amaBhungane in 2019. He's going to be providing an introduction to jurisdictions that offer detailed corporate information that can be used in investigations, and also just go through the basic rules of reading financials so that we can quickly grasp how a company is set up and where there may be some interesting things. Thanks, Dewald.
Hi again. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so I thought to do this presentation on financials simply because that's the way you understand corporations. And the reason you need to understand corporations is that that's how power largely is exercised in the world. And it's not just, things like the Guptas who've got these elaborate kickback arrangements and state corruption. It's also about the exercise of power generally. It doesn't have to be illegal. It can be about extractive industries. It can be about the way that resources are redefined as being either public or non-public, belonging to society as a whole or not. How are these things put together? So I want to do a case study which involves following financial statements, little bits of them through various jurisdictions to get a sense of how, one such very large corporation treated what are essentially South African resources. And just by way of introduction, I just want to quite opportunistically use my previous case study of IO again, just to show how I approach, the most basic financial statements. And that is as follows. Okay. So first things first, not all jurisdictions give you the same thing. they say you're getting financial statements. In South Africa, these are 6 monthly statements. There's an intern one for half of a year. There's an annual one for the whole year. By and large, they are private. There's no obligation to make them available to anyone. You can't apply for them even, unless you're a listed company, in which case they have to be public. Other jurisdictions are very different. There are jurisdictions where financial statements are freely available for any private company. There are ones where reporting happens by quarter, not by half year. So there are, infinite variety of permutations of how corporate information is presented or not presented. Also, you do have to bear in mind that they're not always correct or truthful. Just because the auditor has looked at a financial statement doesn't mean what it says is true. This we have learned in South Africa from especially audits conducted by KPMG of illustrious companies like Steinhoff to VBS and others. But just in almost all financial statements, you have 3 basic elements, which is your, used to be called a balance sheet. These days, the nomenclature is statement of financial position. You have an income statement, and you have a cash flow statement. And in reality, the most important part is almost always the notes that follow those statements. Nonetheless, there's a way to read these 3 foundational parts of a financial statement that I think is not always intuitive. So here's your balance sheet. What I would look for is things that change. Specifically things that may be suspicious. So a sudden increase of 100 million in loans to related parties, as we covered earlier at IO, that seems relevant. The fact that we know this company is sitting with cash it shouldn't have, and that cash has dropped by 800 odd million rand, that's relevant. So there's a note for that, there's a note for that. You're going to go to those notes and see what that refers to. The statement of profit or loss, which is your income statement. Now, I find these to be incredibly misleading. The point of this is not really to tell you how much money a company made. It's about analyzing the money it made. It's about telling you the tax liability and so on. Rather, I go to the cash flow statement. Cash flow statement tells you straight up how much money did you lose from your actual operations. Then it tells you, well, how much money did you make from financial operations, which could be speculation, which is interest earned, all of that kind of thing. Then obviously you have your sum total of that. And then that's money in, and money out is dividends. That's the figures I weigh up against each other. So you can see here that this company actually pays out more dividends than it makes money, which explains why its irregular amount of cash is dropping. It's not just that it's making investments, it is actually paying out dividends in excess of the money it's making, which I think is very bad practice. So, okay, fine, you see that finance income consists of interest simply on a bank account. It's not like they're doing anything. And yeah, the dividends, blah, blah, blah. And the most interesting thing about this company perhaps is the related parties. More specifically, that there are an insanely large amount of them, and that this company is doing business with all of them. Just never-ending list, related parties, we are being paid for something. Being premier fishing is, getting money. Why? This is absolutely no reason for a technology company to be paying premier fishing, which is a, related entity, money. So it's worth looking at. And it keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. Now I'm going to look at a case study involving related party reporting specifically. So you'll find that the way companies are structured, related party disclosure is where you get a sense of that. you'll find that there, more often than not, is some kind of small related party stuck in, Mauritius or the British Virgin Islands, which is, probably there because the company is organizing its tax affairs in a, efficient and clever way. And when you're looking at large-scale extractive companies such as ours, such as those you find in South Africa in abundance, mining companies, you find that they're usually tiny marketing offices. And that those somehow seem to be where all the money and all the profit flows through. So here is a story I did last year. It is about a company called Samancor Chrome. Samancor Chrome is a fairly large and very old South African company, as the name suggests. It mines chrome. That chrome, by and large, gets exported, these days largely to China, which also, again, is to be expected. These financial statements come from a few years back in the middle of what was called the super cycle, is when the global economy was kind of overheating before the great crash of 2008. And it was a good time for mining companies because commodity prices were off the hook. So if you look at these financial statements and you look at related party transactions, you'll find that there is an enormous amount of money being sold to a related party. You look further, you'll find the same thing happening the next year. That related party we now see is Samchrome Limited in Malta. So that gets escalated to 5.5 basically billion rand in transactions with yourself, but only in Malta. So it's interesting that Malta actually is very transparent. You can get pretty much any documentation on any company there, unlike the South African situation. So you just have to pay a fee now and again. So this is what you can get. Private companies' financial statements, like a scanned printout, essentially. So you go there, you try and find the South African payments, and there it is. These are in dollars. Back then, the dollar-rand exchange rate was 5, so this exactly corresponds. Okay, the South African transaction is showing up here. This company is a marketing subsidiary, so it technically takes ownership of the chrome, it sells it again, and for some reason, even though it's part of the group, it makes a profit. That profit gets paid out immediately as a dividend, and this company is completely immaterial. It declares its employees as one. It has one person employed in this Malta office, which probably isn't the office at all. So now, who gets that dividend that's been declared? The middle arrow. The shareholder of this company, again, Malta simply declares these things. You just have to go to the company register. It's a company called Chrome Holdings. Okay, so Chrome Holdings is also in Malta. Now, what is Chrome Holdings? We get Chrome Holdings annual report. Chrome Holdings is owned by something called Kermis. And Kermis is where it ends, because British Virgin Islands is a dead end or a black information hole, basically. Fortunately, we know that Kermis actually belongs to a Croatian man who is also the majority owner of Samancor Chrome in South Africa. Now, what he achieves with this structure is that he completely owns the marketing subsidiary, but he doesn't completely own the South African mining company. There you have shares belonging to minorities, workers through a ESOP trust own a part of that company, BE partners own a part of that company. But the company that workers and BE partners have shares in is paying all its profit to a company they don't have shares in, which is owned all out 100% by the majority stakeholder, which is the Croatian guy. So this structure is basically designed to rip off minority shareholders. Quite a Usually you see this kind of thing meant to evade taxes. In this case, you do evade taxes, but more importantly, you avoid sharing the spoils of your economic activities with South African actors. You just take the money offshore, which I think, even though it might not technically even be illegal, it doesn't involve any public money as per se, apart from the resources that technically are publicly owned in the ground. Nonetheless, I think it's worth investigation and interrogation and censure. Okay, so financial statements like that allow you to make, that kind of, follow that kind of money trail, make that kind of investigation, but where do you get them? Like I said, the public available ones you get from companies on stock exchanges. All the state-owned companies in South Africa, in principle, publish their annual reports. We sometimes get leaked ones. You can't count on that. You can't initiate an investigation of your own volition. You're just kind of waiting. But in this instance, for instance, the first set of financial statements, which was of a private company, came in a court case, a South African company. And from there, we went to Malta and further into Malta, into the British Virgin Islands. And that is where you get jurisdictions, and jurisdictions like Malta, which are incredibly helpful and incredibly transparent compared to us. So in South Africa, the only resource you have is SIPC, which is the company Intellectual Property Commission, which gives you incredibly limited information, tells you the address of a company, tells you when it was registered, tells you who the directors are. It doesn't tell you anything about the finances or the shareholding. So we have the COR 24 process we spoke about earlier. That tells you the shareholders at least, but you still don't know anything about the finances. Now, the other countries we have used for investigations, and I mean, the way you discover the availability of information is kind of project specific. You find that the trail of a company or money you're chasing ends up in Cyprus. And so you try and look what you can get in Cyprus, and so on and so on. And so over time, you get to know databases that exist. Some of these are free. You just have to register with the government. And some of them are mediated through private companies. Some of those are cheap. Some of those are prohibitively expensive. So there are a few I've come up against that have been fairly useful. So like I said, the Malta Business Registry, free shareholder information, you pay for the documents like the financial statements, excellent resource. Surprisingly, Abu Dhabi is very transparent. You can get shareholder information there for free. Just register a free account. Here's one that has been incredibly useful for India. It's a company called Zalba Corp, which is a data company. Let's just go there. You can search any private company in India. Let's just go to, say, Argef Holdings. Argef Holdings is a company owned by the Gupta family's in-law, Akash Garg. The guy got married at Sun City, most South Africans know very well. If you wanted to know more about this guy, you would create an account here. I have one. And here we are. I want to know everything about this company. I go to documents, and basically you have everything this company has ever filed to the registrar in India. This includes things like this, audited financial statements, easy peasy. Very, very useful. It's been especially useful because of the Gupta family. You can trace a lot of their activity using that tool. Cyprus Corporate Registry, also wide open, basic things for free. You pay again for documents. that's fairly expensive, and you pay in euro. But still, if you know something is there, you can go there. Sorry. Companies House in the UK, very cool resource. Any company in the UK, free search, you can get the financial statements, the shareholders, all sorts of things, pretty much everything you need to understand the company and follow what it's doing. But then, you know, there's limitations, and sometimes those limitations are your resources, not the existence of information. So there are services like this one, which is InfoClipper. InfoClipper is ludicrously expensive, but if you have the budget, also ludicrously useful. Essentially, it collects anything publicly available in any country in the world. So you could get, the kind of thing you could get here is to go to, the recent story I did was on group activity in Uzbekistan. You could go here and pull up a document. Sorry. Like the following. This is the Articles of Association of a Uzbek company.
Diewold, I think you'll have to exit the presentation if you're going to another document. You're just seeing the presentation right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me do that. Right, can you see that?
No, it's still your PowerPoint.
No. Tell you what, I'm just going to close that. No?
No, I think if you just go back to the share screen thing at the top, the green thing, it might give you an option to just toggle between.
I see. Yeah, there you go.
There we go.
Yeah? How are we doing?
Yep, you can see it.
Okay. Like, you know, I mean, imagine trying to get this otherwise. Uzbekistan corporate information. You can see our friend Akash Garg owning 50% of a company. Unfortunately, I think this document would have cost me 2,000 Rand if we hadn't otherwise procured it from a source. So there's that problem about the availability of information. This unfortunately necessary because the nature of the stuff we do is like that example I had earlier. It is transnational. It always is. And that one I did is in principle all publicly available information, nothing leaked, but you have to be able to sometimes pay for resources or just do a lot of work to find those resources in other countries. So yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to be running a little bit over schedule. I'll be speaking now about journalism and the law. So we'd really appreciate it if you stuck around. I'm just going to be sharing my screen quickly so you can see my next presentation. Okay, so what I'll be talking to you about now is journalism and the law. And what we're trying to look at is how we can use the law to push the boundaries of access and other issues that affect journalists. And this is in order to make sure that the work of journalists is easier, right? So I think the first point to note is that the law is not static, it's ever changing, and there's always some new frontier, particularly as it concerns access to information. And no country is perfect in providing access to information. There's always some way that it can be improved. I think it's also to note that law, once a statute is passed, it's not set in stone. It has to be revised in order to be fit for purpose. So there are always opportunities to revisit the law and change them so that it can improve the work of journalists. So what I'll be talking about is advocacy, and more specifically, public participation through available mechanisms to push for a particular policy or law. So a lot of what I do is to, for instance, where there's a draft bill or anything that comes out, I read it with an eye to, for instance, transparency issues. So what does this mean? Does this close off information, or is there a way that we can make information more accessible? So that touches on the two aspects that I'll be looking at. Number one is the lawmaking process, and then second is the use of the courts. So I think the starting point of advocacy from in a journalism context is to look at, what do I as a journalist need? So one of the first things as an investigative journalist, you'll need greater access to information. So that means, do I need the information of, who is the holding company of another company? Or, for instance, we've been involved with making comments on the public procurement bill. We want to know how those processes are run and get greater transparency in those areas. The other issue is that as a journalist, you would not want to be prosecuted for doing your job. And so that's why we have to be vigilant about laws that can impede on your freedoms in that respect. So we look at the Protection of State Information Bill and also the RICA Act, which was conducting surveillance against journalists. So these were important cases that required advocacy in order to make sure that the rights of journalists were protected. Another issue that is coming to the forefront is industry changes. And I think particularly when you look at COVID-19, the media landscape is changing, and potentially not for the better, where there's not enough or sufficient funding to sustain credible independent media. So this is potentially an advocacy issue as well, and something that the law might be able to assist in. Okay, so first I'm just going to turn to legislative processes. So the first thing to note is that the Constitution requires that public involvement is facilitated in legislative processes. So how do you kind of jump in to that process as a member of the public with an advocacy intention? So the first thing you need to look at is, when the bill is tabled before Parliament, there'll be a call for comment. And PMG very helpfully and usefully collects these on their website, so you can have a look at that and see all the available and open calls for comment. Always just keep in mind the closing date. And these are something that you put together and submit. You can just submit it over email. The parliamentary website itself, where I've got that link there, actually provides very useful suggestions on how to kind of frame your comment. So there's no prescribed kind of formula or form that you fill out. It's really left to you. They can even take, there's no prescribed length, for instance. But with that said, there are definitely things that you can do to make your submission much more approachable and effective. So I'd really suggest looking at some of those suggestions. They include things like being as clear and concise as possible, and identifying particular provisions and giving very constructive, very definite feedback on what is the problem or how those can be improved. You can make general atmospheric comments as well about a bill that's being considered, but those are less likely to be effective. So it's better to be as incisive as you can. So after you submit your written submissions, and in that you can indicate whether you'd be open to presenting orally as well, you can be invited to make oral presentations. So that pre-COVID-19, you'd be able to go into Parliament and stand before the Portfolio Committee and make presentations there. But now the process is being handled largely electronically. What I think is one very useful thing that can be applied is to provide for legislative drafting suggestions. And this can be quite a technical exercise, but it's basically looking at the proposed legislation and proposing insertions and deletions that will actually cure the defect that you've identified. So that can be quite an extensive process. And although it can be almost daunting to try to rework legislation, I also think something to note there is that it doesn't have to be perfect. So it doesn't have to be perfect legally. You can make the suggestions kind of to the best of your ability, because remember, the Parliament has got legislative drafting experts who are there to make sure that it's sound legally, that cross-references match up and definitions are provided for. So I think you can kind of do the best you can, but also just know that it doesn't have to be perfect. That shouldn't discourage you from making those suggestions. Okay, sorry, just moving to my next slide. So there are some pros and cons when it comes to to making submissions in the parliamentary process. Sorry, before I go there, I also want to note that as legislation is being drafted, there may actually be more than one opportunity to comment. So sometimes the department itself, before the bill is tabled before Parliament, will solicit comments on the draft bill. So that happened, for instance, with the Companies Amendment Bill, and that's where we took the opportunity to engage regarding beneficial ownership transparency. So that has actually still been, and that's been multiple kind of back and forth sessions with the DTI, and we're trying to get those suggestions as entrenched as possible. But even if it eventually, the bill that goes to that comes out of cabinet and goes to Parliament is one that doesn't include those suggestions or insufficient, what we can do then is engage in the parliamentary process, which I've just discussed, and try to make an inroads over there. So now turning to some of the pros and cons. Again, there's no restrictions in your submissions. It's not kind of a formalized legal process like what you have with a litigation court process where you've got pleadings and formulas for heads of argument. You really can make whatever suggestion you feel is necessary to make. I also know that there's no cost implications. It's free to it's absolutely free to the public. Anybody can comment, and basically all it requires is your time to sit down and formulate your submissions. It has long-term benefit because even though laws are revised, they're revised when they don't work. So if you are making suggestions to improve a particular statute, there's a chance that it will persist for a long time, and you can be very impactful in making these submissions. There are some cons. So the first is that it's obviously there'll be competing interests. So you might be in favor of greater transparency and openness, but there may be somebody else who says, no, this should be a closed process. There's interests of privacy at play. And you basically going to have to persuade the parliamentary committee to that your view is superior. The second issue is that legislation is quite technical, as I mentioned, with regard to drafting. And sometimes, for instance, with the public procurement bill, it was quite an extensive, I think it was about an 80-page bill. There were so many issues that are prevalent in that bill, and not only transparency. So we just had to put on our kind of journalism focus and transparency focus and say, we're not going to try and tackle the entirety of this bill because it's not possible. There's a lot that can be revised. We're just going to focus on how can we improve transparency. So sometimes it takes that bit of laser focus, but there's, when you change one thing in a bill, it changes something else. And there's a lot of intricacies that can come into play. Another con is that it's a long process. It can take years. I mean, the Companies Amendment Bill process has been going on for years, and there's still no end in sight. So it takes quite a lot of persistence to eventually get, to reach the end of the process. And hopefully by the end of it, you will have made the impact that you wanted to see. And then another practical con is that the quality of the portfolio committees or the people to whom you're making your presentations, there's quite a degree of difference there. So I don't mean necessarily, something to do with competence, but it's also sometimes just preparedness. There's sometimes you'll go and present and there's somebody who's read all the submissions and they've, formulated questions and they can ask you something. And when you respond, you feel like you're contributing quite meaningfully to the process. But there can also be situations where somebody will ask you something that's literally in your submissions and you know that they've not really read it. And so that can be quite challenging and frustrating, but it's not a reason not to engage with the process, but it can be a challenge. Okay, so now I'm going to go through some of the the questions about advocacy or issues regarding advocacy through litigation. This is another way that you can push your views forward and potentially change the entire landscape for media. So the first point I want to note is the legal principle stare decisis, or stand by your decision. And that's really what we are harnessing when it comes to advocacy. The idea that once a court has handed down a decision, it's legally binding on other courts. It establishes a principle. So, so this is kind of what we're going to be focusing on. So just to note, with Section 16 of the Constitution provides in South Africa's Constitution and the Bill of Rights provides for it provides for a right to freedom of expression, including freedom of the press and other media. So that will often be the right on which we'll be relying when it comes to litigation regarding the interests of journalists. But in order to get to court, you'd need to establish a cause of action. So there needs to be some kind of factual basis that you can take before the courts and use that to kind of put your issue forward. So it could be something like, as I discussed earlier, the refusal of a PIA request, or it can be kind of a deficiency in the litigation that you, in the legislation you've identified. And so that will be the cause of action that will establish the grounds on which you find yourself before court. Another way that you can get before the court is as an amicus curiae, or friend of the court. So that is where you kind of join other litigation that not as a party. So you wouldn't be, facing cost orders, for instance. You're primarily there just to provide context, relevant information, and legal argument about what is the correct course forward. So those are the ways that you can end up before the court. So I just would like to discuss very quickly some litigation that we were involved in, which concerns Section 417 of the 1973 Companies Act. And that was very recent, that was in September. But basically that provision provides for secrecy in relation to inquiries that are held in liquidation proceedings. So basically what happens is the liquidators are trying to get information as to why as to why a company has failed. And so they are able to subpoena witnesses to appear, and the witnesses give evidence. So obviously that information is quite sensitive to the company, and the witnesses, they don't want to discourage witnesses from being frank. And so Section 417(7) provides that these proceedings are closed by default. So this is what we wanted to challenge. Micah, who you heard from earlier, has been doing extensive research into paramount combat systems, and he heard about this inquiry that was going to happen, and he wanted to get access to it. So we tried to use the courts as a way to get into the room. Our first step was to request from the commissioner that access to be granted to us. So it was just a simple letter: can you let us in using your discretion, which the Act provides for? Predictably, we were refused. And so that refusal established our cause of action that took us into the High Court. So what we needed to do in the High Court is to establish why we needed to be in that room. And most importantly, we wanted to show that there was a public interest that should override the blanket transparency, and that if we were able to sit in and report on those proceedings, there would be a benefit for the public generally. So there were a few things that we had to rely on to show that. So because Mike has been doing a lot of research into Paramount, we were able to draw from that to show this is the nature of Paramount's business. We wanted to show about the fact that it was in liquidation and the effect that it had on other stakeholders, such as employees. And also we looked at the nature of Paramount, the entire Paramount Group's activities, and which included, for instance, their presence in conflicts around the world. So these were all kind of reasons that we used to buttress our argument that we needed to be in that space. We also talked about the fact that simply by being in the room, it kind of exerts a watchdog. There's a watchdog presence, which can actually make the process more credible and kind of hold everybody who's involved in that process to account. So the outcome of this, we were actually ultimately not successful. Our application was dismissed due to a lack of urgency. We brought the application on an urgent basis. It is very difficult to prove urgency. And so, I mean, while it was disappointing, it was I mean, it was disappointing, don't get me wrong. But also, we also noticed that there was no costs award made against us. So that to us was a sign that the court, or the judge who was deciding our case, didn't regard that we had brought the case frivolously, that there was something there, but we couldn't cross that hurdle of urgency. So what's the next step? So ordinarily, a next step that you can think about in litigation is appeal. But because the proceedings were due to take place the next week, appeal wasn't really an option that we could look at. So our next step that we are considering is basically starting over to get the transcripts of the proceedings. So we weren't able to be in the room itself, which would have been first prize, but second prize would be to get the transcripts. So that's going to be the next challenge for us, and we're going to be looking into how we can do that. I just want to make a note about journalists as respondents. Sometimes you're not the initiator of litigation. Sometimes you actually receive a court case on your desk and you've now been informed that you're a respondent in a case. And one of the most unfortunate aspects of this is where journalists are cited as respondents or they face legal threats in order to prevent them from actually getting the information out into the public realm. So this is known as the chilling effect. It works almost as a prior restraint. It is a huge deterrent to actually publishing the story, and it is very unfortunate. If I can talk about one instance that amaBhungane has faced, we've recently received a lawyer's letter from the UK, and basically saying, and this was in relation to the Paramount stories that I was just talking about that Mike has been running. And this was basically a threat that we had breached UK privacy and data protection law, which was obviously something that's quite concerning to us, especially since defending a case in a foreign jurisdiction is prohibitively expensive, even if the law is on your side. So this is something that we've now had to look at and see how we can respond to this. Nothing has materialized so far, but obviously it remains a concern. And this is not just a concern for amaBhungane. What's known as jurisdiction shopping or libel tourism, all of these concepts have been around for a long time. But basically, the point I want to make is that in South Africa's jurisprudence alone, there's been many examples where in defending yourself as a journalist, you have an opportunity to have a lasting impact on the law. So I just wanted to highlight that. So some pros and cons of going to the courts. First, it can be very impactful. So you can through the whole idea of stare decisis, you can have an impact on the law for a long time to come and change the playing field for many journalists. Another pro is that it turns on the strength of legal argument. So compared to the parliamentary process where you have to be quite persuasive, it's almost as a lawyer, it's a whole different set of skills where you're not trying to kind of by force show the superiority of your arguments. In the legislative process, it's almost like taking the parliamentary committee through the steps and convincing them. Here, if you've got a strong legal case, you should, as long as you've got a good judge, you should come out on the right side. And, you know, and even if you don't, there's opportunities to appeal as well. So, you know, you can often predict your success a lot, or the prospects of success a lot better when it comes to a legal case. The con is it's very, very expensive. There are, sometimes you could get pro bono representation, and that's great if you can get it. But sometimes even if you win a case and you get costs awarded in your favor, it's not going to cover the actual cost of running the litigation. So that's something to keep in mind. The next fact is that you're limited by the facts of your case. So it just, for example, about Section 417 case, we might have had a case where there was not a very strong public interest. And so then that's something that you need to take into consideration very carefully before going to court. You want to get the best possible set of facts so that you can make your case before the court. And then, of course, linked to the cost is that you could potentially get an adverse costs award, in which case you'd be liable to pay the costs of the other party. That's something that's obviously very, very concerning and you want to guard against. So heading towards the end of my presentation, I want to point out that sometimes advocacy means going both through the courts and through the legislative process, because sometimes you can be successful in getting legislation declared to be unconstitutional. And then the court makes an order, and this would be the constitutional court because they'll have to confirm that the declaration of invalidity. But they could actually make an order with a remedy where the legislation is sent back to Parliament to correct the legislative defect, in which case you'll have to go and find yourself before Parliament, making sure that the way that they do this is actually correct and kind of is close to what the Constitutional Court's judgment was and their findings. And that can be a whole process. We went through that with the Paya Amendment bill, which concerned the political party funding aspect. And Paya had to subsequently be amended, and we went before Parliament to make submissions on that. Ultimately, I still think that those the resultant legislation was imperfect, but that's what you sometimes end up with. And then I also want to make the point that in other cases, advocacy needs more. So the courts and going through a legislative process is insufficient. So the picture that you see here is from the Right to Know protests against the Protection of State Information Bill. And that means basically taking advocacy onto the streets. And that is an option. We have to remember that we are citizens, we are agents of democratic change, and we must always make sure that we hold onto that power and use it as best we can and in a responsible way. And to conclude, may the fight continue. Thanks. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And that's going to conclude our session now. Just going to open the chat. Great. So we've got a workshop coming up. I just wanted to let you know about the next session that's going to be hosted as part of AIJC. It's going to be the Making Investigative Journalism Sustainable, run by GIJN, and that's going to be at 3:30. Thank you so much for your time and have a lovely afternoon.